Before we get started with the first session, we have a virtual participant who'd like to speak to you. Can you please cue up the video? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Vince Cerf. I'm Google's Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist, but some of you may know me as one of the co-inventors of the Internet. I'm speaking to you today at the invitation of Melinda Ankerfer, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, and of course I do anything for my Stanford colleagues. More important, she's also on the board of the co-sponsor of this conference, the Institute of Digital Media and Child Development. My interest in all this as a layperson is to understand more fully what happens as our young brains are interacting with online resources, the kinds of video games that we see children playing, or the tablets and pads, keyboards, laptops, desktops that have become increasingly available to and used by young people. I think we know, at least now in the 21st century, that when we're born, our brains are actually heavily connected, and that as we encounter stimuli, that those parts of the neural structure that are not stimulated begin to essentially dissipate. And so we edit our brains as we experience life around us and as we are affected by various kinds of stimuli. The question, of course, is whether anything interesting or unusual or potentially hazardous happens to our brains as we're interacting with online sources. And that's why this conference is so important, because we don't know the answer to that question, and there is a research agenda which needs to be developed and presumably prioritized so that we can find out answers to that question. And so although I can't be with you in person, I do appreciate the opportunity to highlight how important I think this work is, and I certainly look forward to hearing what happens as a consequence of your meeting, whether a research agenda is in fact developed, and of course in the long run, what is the outcome of prosecuting that agenda. So although I can't be there with you in person, I will see you on the net.
I'm tempted to also say that I wish we had a video message from Al Gore. Most of you probably get that. So I want to start out with a few comments. First of all, I want to emphasize two things in the title of this panel. Science, what does science tell us? Which is, we're all scientists, and we're going to try to focus on that. And violent. We're not talking about all video games. We're talking about violence in video games. Having said that, I just want to start with some warnings, 3 warnings, which I feel particularly strongly about. The first is, don't trust what the press reports about this issue. There's a large money-making industry that's feeling threatened, and they have a large publicity machine to influence the press. The topic's complex, and most journalists aren't really well prepared to either understand the psychological processes underlying the effects we're talking about or the statistics. And the press always like to present dissenting opinions, even when they have little validity. Just as an example, very recently, some of you might know, the American Psychological Association had a panel of very distinguished scholars, chaired by Mark Applebaum, a very distinguished psychometrician and quantitative psychologist, with Ken Dodge, a very distinguished researcher on aggression, on the panel. And nobody on the panel really had done research on violent video games. And they conclude that there was a link between playing violent video games and aggression, but they found that there's insufficient research to date to link violent video game playing with criminal violence. How's that been reported in the press? Well, a variety of ways. Here's not too bad. Violent video games cause aggression, but do they cause kids to commit crimes? A new task force report says children who play violent video games are more prone to aggression, but not necessarily criminal activity. Well, that's a little bit different than saying insufficient evidence exists to conclude that. Weekly News magazine says the problem, though, is that many experts think the APA's findings are junk science. 230 researchers at Harvard, Yale, and Columbia universities take issue with it, and so on and so on. And then EduCause just came out with this statement: fears that violent video games will cause people to be more violent are understandable, but unsupported by current research. Well, you've got to decide who's credible here. The second warning I want to give you is that don't trust empirical results that don't have a psychological process explanation that fits with known psychological facts. In particular, a number of people who dismiss results with violent video games say that, oh yes, I know that if you see violent people around you in your family or in your neighborhood or in your peers, then you're likely to become more violent, but not with violent video games or violent media. Well, there's just no psychological foundation for that. We know basically that how violence begets violence. Violence produces changes in a variety of mediating social cognitions, and those cognitions, when primed, then lead to increased risk for behaving violently. This is well understood and has been established by a large amount of research. So if someone comes up with a finding and doesn't bother to talk about the theoretical explanation for it, you should wonder, how good is that finding? How valid is it? Finally, now that I'm 72, this is particularly meaningful. Don't forget or dismiss older research done on effects of exposure to more passive violent media. There's a lot of research that's 50 years old now that is really very relevant. Here's a study Len Aaron and I did in between 1970 and 1980 that showed that 8-year-olds who saw more violent TV 10 years later behaved more aggressively, regardless of whether they were low, medium, or high initially on aggression. In every group, the high violence viewers behaved more aggressively. Here's another study that showed a 15-year effect from 1977 to 1995 on first, second, third, fourth, fifth graders. And my favorite quote from long ago now, and if we wanted to talk about crime, this showed in that study, we found that violent TV viewing at age 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 was actually related for males to a greater risk of being arrested for a crime 15 years later. But here's my favorite quote. It is clear to me that the causal relationship between exposure to televised violence and antisocial behavior is sufficient to warrant appropriate and immediate remedial action. There comes a time when the data are sufficient to justify action. That time has come. When was that said? That was said by the Surgeon General of the United States, Jesse Steinfeld, in 1972. Okay, having said that, now we're going to proceed to answering some specific questions about science about violent video games. And we're going to start with this question. Do violent video games increase the risk of aggressive behavior by the player immediately after he plays the game? How do we know this? Does habitual playing of violent games increase the risk of aggressive behavior players long after playing? How do we know this? Is the aggressive behavior engendered sometimes violent behavior that hurts others? How do we know this? Is it sometimes criminal behavior? How do we know this? And what we're going to do is have a short presentation by Professor Craig Anderson of Iowa State, and then we'll take a few minutes for the other panel members to add their views. Okay, Craig?
Okay, 7 minutes here. 70 years of research on media violence in 7 minutes. That seems about right. Right? Okay. All right. Let's get to it here. All right. What I want to show here, this actually includes some of the older studies, the TV movie violence studies. Basically, you can break down kinds of studies into 3 types: experimental ones, cross-sectional ones, longitudinal ones. And what I've done here is put up the sample sizes that this comes out of a variety of meta-analyses in the TV movie domain and in the violent video game domain. My water cup is threatening to drown the mouse here. That's probably not a good idea. And what you find is that regardless of research method, and regardless of whether you're talking older kinds of what are sometimes called passive media, not exactly a good term, but or whether you're talking about more modern video games, you get the same effects. When you do the proper meta-analyses, you find, gosh, exposure to media violence increases aggressive behavior or is associated with increased aggressive behavior, pretty much regardless of how you do the study. Another way of asking the same question, how do we know, especially for non-science types, how do we know that these effects are real? Well, one way is you ask reputable scientific societies who have reviewed the question and see what conclusions do they come to. And so what I've simply shown on this slide is the large number of organizations, many of whom typically don't agree with each other on much of anything. And yet on the media violence issue, and including the video game violence issue, you have virtually unanimous agreement across the board. I just want to sort of remind you briefly what some of the other questions that I was asked to mention briefly about, well, how violent is the behavior? Is there any evidence of criminal activity? And then I wanted to add one more question because I thought, 7 minutes was too much time to cover 70 years of research. So I also want to talk a little bit about the generality of the effects and the magnitude of the effects. And we'll see if we can get all this in. Here's a list of the kinds of aggressive behaviors that have been used in violent video game studies of one kind or another. Now keep in mind that when we talk about aggressive behavior, at least as a social psychologist and as most human aggression researchers would agree, by aggressive behavior we mean behavior that is intended to harm another individual who does not want to be harmed. Okay? So we have things like punishment level for some opponent, typically in a laboratory-based task, might be a noise blast over headphones, might be having to eat hot sauce. In the old days, most of these studies would have been done with electric shock, but IRBs prefer noise blasts, even though the electric shock stuff is actually safer, but they don't know that. Some of the field studies involve things like hitting, kicking, punching, and biting. I should point out that these are not typically studies done with college students. These are usually younger kids. Getting into fights at school, gang fights, behaviors that would be called physical assault and would be, in fact, illegal if known to the police. Physical assault against teachers, parents, peers, other people. Sexual assault, including rape. Obviously, you don't ask research participants, have you ever raped someone? But you give scenarios that are essentially rape scenarios and say, have you ever done this? And robbery, verbal aggression, teacher ratings, peer ratings, parent ratings, and actually several longitudinal and some cross-sectional studies looking at juvenile delinquency, including violent juvenile delinquency. This list never appears, of course, in the Newsweek or Time magazine or the other public kinds of things that are devoted to denying that there are any harmful effects. All right, let me move on. This is an unpublished study that a bunch of colleagues from around the world and I have been working on. We just finished analyzing data last week and we're getting ready to submit it. We have roughly 2,000 participants from 6 countries, widely different countries, different in a number of ways. So we have Japan, China, the US, Australia, Croatia, and Romania are represented here. We have standardized measures of media violence and aggression across these countries, and a lot of fancy analyses that my graduate students know more about than I do. But basically the point I want to make here is that Media violence is not the smallest risk factor in this group. In fact, in this particular data set, it's larger than growing up in a neighborhood with lots of violent crime, larger than sex effects, larger than abusive parenting, larger than peer victimization. Only peer delinquency in this particular study showed a larger effect. I'm going to skip this so that my colleagues have time, and I'll just leave this slide up. I know take-home messages are supposed to be 3 points and no more. I understand that. I couldn't do that, so I've got 6 here. But I'll just leave those there, and so we'll have time to move on. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to take no more than 4 minutes to let anyone else comment on these. Who would like to comment?
Well, sure.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry, Tom Hummer from the Indiana University School of Medicine. I think one of the points, actually, when Craig was talking, he was showing about the different contributors to aggression. And sometimes some of the research tries to, say, compare media violence as a risk factor to compare to other factors. And I think that, in some sense, loses the big picture. It doesn't really matter too much, I guess, whether one risk factor is a little bigger or a little smaller than the others. It's still a risk factor regardless, and it still, I think, needs to be treated. If you can minimize that risk factor, then you are helping address the problem, even if some other risk factors still exist.
Okay. Anybody else? If not, I want to make one comment. One of the most annoying things to me about a lot of the popular coverage is this belief that video game violence might cause kind of trivial aggression, you know, as someone said, breaking balloons of other kids and things like that, but not any serious aggression or criminal. And that's just not true. We have a lot of evidence that it is a risk factor for getting into fights, literally punching, choking, kicking, slugging, threatening people with weapons, using knives, using guns. We have evidence that it does predict who's likely to be arrested for crimes later on. We have evidence that among prisoners, for example, one study in an Indiana prison, those who were imprisoned for violent versus nonviolent games, a significant distinguishing factor among them is whether they played violent video games or not. So there's a lot of evidence about this. I can understand why the APA panel would say this is one area in which there's insufficient evidence to reach a very strong conclusion, but they were being very conservative, really, and as very good scholars often are. You shouldn't, and no one should think from that there's not an effect on violent behavior that leads to, that would be called criminal behavior. Again, thinking of the psychological theory and neurological processes, it's hard to think of something that would produce increases in all sorts of aggressive and violent behavior and somehow just stop at the point in which it was called a crime. It's just not feasible.
Well, and
Sure.
Since you're talking about our findings. For one thing, I'm Sandra Calvert. I'm from Georgetown University.
Can you stand up, please, Sandy? Can you go to the mic, please?
Actually, Sandy, we're under time pressure. Can I ask you, at the end, I'll pick you the first person to make a comment. But
I would be happy to, but you're saying things about my committee, and so I really would like to comment on that.
I was a compliment.
Well, I'd like to tell you more about our procedure.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you just to wait, because otherwise we won't get through it. Okay? Okay, so let's go to a slightly different question. What psychological and neurological processes account for the short-term effect of playing violent video games on aggressive behavior? What brain functioning accounts for immediate increased risk of behaving aggressively. How do we know this? Okay. And Tom Hummer of Indiana University is going to try to answer that question.
Okay, thank you. Just quickly, a real short overview about the types of neuroimaging research that goes on with in video game research, of which we've conducted some. It's basically 3 types, and some of it has actually been covered already in this conference. One type just comparing experienced versus non-experienced video gamers on some sort of category, whether that be violent video game players versus non-violent video game players, or those who have played a lot versus not played a lot, so that sort of observational study. There's also studies that have looked at neuroimaging or brain function while people are playing games. Those kind of studies are exciting and, as a neuroscientist, actually really hard to interpret. So I'm not going to talk about those too much. And then there's a few studies about what happens immediately after video game play. And I think one thing I want to emphasize is that these neuroimaging methods are best used in tandem or with to be integrated with the psychological and behavioral research to form a cohesive model. So it shouldn't really stand on its own as evidence, but rather integrated into this larger picture. So just a basic framework so we can orient ourselves. And I apologize, it looked okay on my computer, but. So here's a basic sort of neurobiological model of aggressive behavior. This is a simple model, leaves a bunch out, and this is mainly dealing with reactive aggression. So there's an immediate provocation or threat, and someone reacts to it. So what happens if there is some sort of threat is the brain's arousal centers, including the amygdala, has an immediate response. Basically telling the rest of the brain, hey, this is important, this is something you need to deal with. That interacts with a network of regions that handles basically our worldview and our script about how to behave in certain situations, whether the other person's pain is important, things like that. These two interact with more top-down regulatory regions, like especially lateral prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which help control those types of behaviors and make decisions about whether the threat is important to respond to. So our research and others has found that immediately following violent video game play, there are a couple of effects. So we did a study where we had adolescents play either a violent first-person shooter game or a non-violent racing game, so equally exciting, equally physiologically arousing. And after they did that for about half an hour, we had them do a couple tasks while they were in an fMRI scanner. So one thing we have found is that those who played the violent game immediately after, while they were doing a task, and an emotional Stroop task. Basically, they saw aggressive words, kill, hit, punch, that sort of thing. Their job was just to identify the ink color of the word. So basically, they're supposed to ignore the aggressive information. We found that those who played the violent game were basically primed to have that amygdala, that emotional response to those aggressive words compared to the nonviolent game group. What we also found is that the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge essentially of communicating with the amygdala to tamp down some of that emotional response, that communication was disrupted in the violent game group. There's also similar research has found using EEG, that's where you have electrical recordings on the scalp. Essentially, a similar finding where those who played a violent game, and the finding was especially pronounced in inexperienced players, basically playing a violent game produced a decreased response compared to the nonviolent game group, and this was in more prefrontal regions. So this is a more regulatory response. And in that study, they actually were able to associate that with the behavioral response. We've also found reduced prefrontal activity immediately following violent video game play, with a similar paradigm comparing a violent game play immediately after to a nonviolent video game play. And these are cognitive tasks. This is a counting Stroop task. You're just supposed to regulate information. The go, no go, similarly, this is measures inhibition. So you're supposed to press a button for a certain, every letter, unless you're shown the letter X, you inhibit that response. We found there's lateral prefrontal cortex is involved in inhibiting that behavioral response. We found lower activity after playing a violent video game. Now, I think this research needs to be integrated with another area of research that often talks about action video game effects, but a lot of times they're talking about the same thing, typically first-person shooter games. And they discuss, there's findings related to visuospatial attention, perhaps better awareness about objects around a wider field of view, for instance. And sometimes that's referred to increased attention. And I think this is basically two sides of the same coin. They find similar effects that we do, basically increased or higher responses. This isn't immediately after, but it's in nonviolent versus violent game players. But a higher response to information that is typically ignored. Here, the actual purpose of the task was to be able to, how well you could detect information on the periphery. Now, if that's what you're trying to test, then it's good that you can be able to detect that. Now, you have to also view this in terms of if you're in a classroom and you're trying to inhibit information, and if you are better able to experience or see input and make sure that information is important that's happening around the periphery, that's not good. If you're playing a video game, you need to know where the enemy's coming from. It's a good thing to be able to see those things that are going around. So I think a lot of this research is showing basically that playing violent video games and these action games involves a shifting of neural resources or strategies from one where we typically inhibit unimportant or regulate unimportant or unwanted information and behaviors, such as immediately responding, to one that is more aware of information that's happening around the periphery or being able to detect multiple objects at once, for instance. It actually goes well with the sort of multitasking literature that we were discussing yesterday about being aware of more than one thing at once. Well, that can counteract the ability to focus on a single thing at a time. And I think it's important to note that these processes are sort of, like I said, two sides of the same coin. So revisiting our model, basically if there is a provocation and someone has played a violent video game and they are aroused, the emotional regions of the brain are primed to respond. There is an altered script about how to behave or how the world is behaving towards oneself. At the same time, we have this reduction in inhibitory mechanisms in the prefrontal cortex that are supposed to regulate that emotional response. End result is more aggressive behavior. And we've talked about it a couple times so far here, but I want to re-emphasize the importance of neurodevelopment, especially with the prefrontal cortex not fully maturing basically until your mid-20s, and especially the sort of connections between prefrontal cortex and other regions in the brain. During adolescence and childhood, because those prefrontal regions aren't fully developed, they may be more susceptible to these effects. Emotional regions, on the other hand, are maturing or more sensitive. at the same time. So this mismatch occurs, and the prefrontal cortex, especially during adolescence, isn't able to regulate those emotional responses. Thank you.
Would anyone on the panel like to add some comments? Question? Craig?
Just one. Is this on? Yeah. Just one sort of quick comment that there are now at least 2 training studies, unpublished training studies. Tom's group has one, and my group has one, where we essentially take relatively inexperienced gamers. It's hard to find people who don't play any games anymore. We've got relatively inexperienced ones, and experimentally, randomly assigned to roughly a 10-hour training condition. Some of them are playing these fast-paced action games. Some are playing slower-paced kind of video games. Some are in a no-game control condition. And we've been finding that as few as 10 hours of such training can lead to poorer performance on certain kinds of executive control measures. And that's kind of frightening. And these are college-age students or older, right? I forget your sample.
Yep.
Was it all college?
Yeah, under age 30.
Yeah. So, some of these executive control things are starting to look pretty scary. But again, those are unpublished yet, and need to be replicated, and we need bigger designs and all that.
Okay. Anyone else?
A request that my colleagues there to be able to set the record straight on some of the work that we do as representatives. I'm happy to come up.
Well, we're going to have a question and comment period afterwards. Yes, okay. Yeah, okay. Right. Any other comments on this? Okay. Then we're going to turn to a slightly different question. What psychological or neurological processes account for longer-term effects of habitual playing of violent video games? Does habitual playing of violent video games have different effects from habitual viewing of violent TV and movies? Why are the children and youth more at risk than adults? Why? How does habitual playing change attitudes about aggression and violence? Do habitual players think the world is a more hostile place and believe violence is more normative? What are the consequences of these cognitive effects for the risks for aggression, delinquency, and crime? And Jay Hull from Dartmouth is going to give us some answers to these questions.
Hi. You've heard both yesterday and today there's a controversy. You can see that there's some defensiveness on the part of people talking about this literature. You've heard there are 2 camps, and then you heard, oh, there's one person in a camp. I'm not in either camp. 5 years ago, I said I had no interest in doing aggression research. My own research background is in self-knowledge, identity, and I got interested in doing this kind of work because I thought that take on the video game literature was missing, so I started looking at a large data set, thanks to Jim Sargent, my collaborator. It's a longitudinal study that I'll get into in a couple minutes. But I think that you deserve to hear kind of like the main arguments that are being made against the video games, and I hope that you'll treat me as kind of like a fair arbiter. Again, I'm not in either one of the camps. I'll probably get flack from both of the camps, but I want to go through the basic attacks on this literature and then my own take on that, and we can talk about that. So I see 4 major kinds of arguments that have been leveled at this literature. One of them, Craig's already talked about a little bit, that the behaviors aren't really serious that are being investigated. So what I'm going to talk about in the data that I'm going to be looking at concern longitudinal studies that are simply looking at physical aggression. And the physical aggression measures, again, Craig very nicely laid out the variety of different measures that are looked at. I think they're all serious behaviors. I'm also interested in adolescent risk behaviors generally, and you'll see that, and I'll talk about a variety of ones that I think that there's no doubt that these are relatively serious outcomes, including binge drinking, reckless driving, risky sex, and smoking. So I'm going to be talking about those as well. The second kind of criticism that's been leveled at this is a lot of the studies don't include appropriate statistical controls. And I realize that, there are some people in the audience that are very sophisticated statistically, and there are others who are not, so I won't go through the... My background is basically in statistical modeling. I do linear mixed modeling, structural equation modeling, and longitudinal designs. I teach stats. I'm going to try to stay away from all of that, so if I regress into that kind of language, call me on it. I'll try to bring it very down to a kind of like very straightforward interpretation. But my take on this is the statistical controls that are the main ones of interest is how aggressive was the person at a previous point in time, because that accounts for a lot of the variability. And so if you take into account prior aggression, we'll say, then all of the other statistical controls don't really affect the outcome that much. And that's even true in the major critics data set. So if you go into the major critic, what you would think is, if the argument is you're not including appropriate statistical controls, then their group, must have kind of observed effects which go away when you include appropriate statistical controls. And that's simply not the fact. They don't have effects initially. They include a lot of statistical controls, and they still don't have effects. So again, my take is, if you include prior aggression, you can control the heck out of pretty much everything. It doesn't make that much difference after that point. Third point is a publication bias. Again, I'm going to be talking about longitudinal studies on physical aggression. I've gone through I've done a meta-analysis on all of the longitudinal published studies and unpublished studies that we've been able to find to date. We've done appropriate kinds of tests of publication bias, trim and fill, a variety of different kinds of things I won't go through. We see no evidence of publication bias in that. The fourth kind of criticism is effect sizes. The effects are small. Yeah, so you saw yesterday the kinds of effects that people are talking about, regression weights of 0.10, and then talking about those as being relatively small. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a couple minutes, but that's saying there is an effect, but it's small. So let's go through what might be responsible for that effect. That's what Rowell tasked me with. What could be the possible mediators of those effects? These games have effects. Why do they have effects? What is the mediator? What is responsible for the subsequent effect on aggression? So if you look at the longitudinal studies with mediational analyses, there seems to be a consequence of playing these games on aggressive cognitions. People think differently as a consequence of that, and because they think differently, then you see increased aggression. And that thinking differently includes normative beliefs, so they're more likely to think that aggression is an appropriate response to a provocation. They're more likely to have hostile attribution, so in an ambiguous situation, they're more likely to interpret the intention of the other person as being hostile, and they're more likely to engage in aggressive fantasizing, which I think explains itself. You can compare different kinds of aggressive cognitions. I have some citations in here for that kind of comparison. Barbara Krahe and her colleague looked at these normative beliefs, whether they're a stronger predictor than the hostile attributions. They found that they were. But again, the general argument is cognitions generally are changed in the direction that I just went over, and as a consequence of that change, lead to change in aggression. What we've looked at, again, coming at this more identity point of view, is personality changes. So our take is less you play these games, you learn aggressive responses, and then you enact those kind of aggressive responses when given the opportunity out in the real world. Our take is more, you play these games and you enter into a virtual world. You occupy a kind of different role, a character, and that influences who you are, how you feel about yourself, and then that version of yourself has a kind of leakage into everyday life. So we look at personality mediators, in particular increases in sensation seeking. So people who play these games show increased desire to do dangerous things, exciting things, and rebelliousness. People who play these games are more likely to feel like they can argue with other people, they can challenge them, they can break rules. Oh, you clean that up. That actually looks nicer. I'm not going to go through this in detail. This is the kind of stuff I do, okay? And all I'm going to point out here really quickly, if you are statistically inclined, you can get something out of this. If you aren't, you might not want to look at the slide, but if you do look at the slide, you can see this This is aggression, subsequent aggression, being predicted by these kinds of games, violent games, and lagging out prior aggression. And you can see that this basically predicts change in this game. Now this is 13, 14 and a half, 15, almost 16, and 18. So you can see it's a long study, longitudinal design. This is what looks like a relatively small effect, and that's pretty typical for the kinds of effects in the literature. If you do a meta-analysis of all of the effects, and then you include the lag of prior aggression, you get effects that are about on that order. So we can talk about measures of these kinds of things if you want to, but I want to move on to the other kinds of variables, outcome variables that I'm interested in. Again, the point is that if you're changing these kind of personality variables of sensation seeking and rebelliousness, it's going to have broader effects than just affecting aggression, increased smoking, increased drinking in a variety of ways, and general deviance. This goes back to the logic of Dick Jesser in the late 1970s. He argued that among adolescents, there's a kind of complex of risk behaviors that include smoking, drinking, risky sex, delinquent behaviors, and reckless driving. And we find that playing these kinds of games is associated in longitudinal designs, statistically controlling prior levels of those variables on all of these things. And they're not trivial effects if you take a look at this kind of graph. So this is smoking. Again, these are the different waves that I talked about. These are the heavy game players. These are the low. So this is just a median split. So these are highs and lows. You can think of that. These are error bars. You can see that this is increased smoking in the last 30 days, where 0 means I haven't smoked at all, and 1 means I've had 1 to 10 cigarettes. You can see this kind of escalating line over the years.
I don't know why that just.
I get my time back, right?
Yeah. But you're almost out of time anyway.
I know. And this is binge drinking. You can see the same kind of effect in binge drinking. Now, the interesting thing about these effects is that in that model that I showed, maybe Rowell put it back on. Yeah, in these kinds of models, that's too busy, I'm not going to talk about. In those kinds of models, if you use these kind of lagged effects, you get a statistical effect that's about 0.10. These look really huge, okay? If you look at them differently, so if you just look at, for example, odds ratios, you split into high and low, and you split into people who are binge drinking or not binge drinking, what is the relative risk for initiating binge drinking? So if you just take people who aren't binge drinking at all, and you look at the next time point, and you're trying to predict who becomes a binge drinker at the next time point and how much increased risk is there, they are not small numbers. They are on the order of 4 to 5 times. The heavy gamers are at 4 to 5 times increased risk of binge drinking for the first time at that next time point, relative to people who are low in those games. And the same thing's true for smoking. You get relative risk of about 3 times. The same thing's true for being sent to the principal's office for fighting. You get relative risk of about 2 times. If you look at D as an effect size measure, for those of you who understand that is, you get effects of about 0.5, 0.6. So what I'm saying is the 0.10 take on effect sizes belies the true nature of the effects that you're looking at, and I think the effects are relatively large. There's one. Am I out of time?
You're out of time.
I'll take questions from.
Thank you, Jay. Okay. So this question came up yesterday, and I think it is an important question. What moderates the effects of aggression on playing violent video games? What individual differences increase or decrease the risk? What characteristics of the game? Are there some inoculating interventions that can be done to reduce the effects? And how do we know this? And to answer these questions, Professor Barbara Krahe from Potsdam University is going to present.
That's the one. Yeah.
Slideshow from the beginning. There you are.
Thank you very much, Rowell. Thank you very much for inviting me to this exciting conference. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to try and answer some aspects of the questions that I've been assigned to address. So the first question follows on from what we've just heard about possible mediating variables. I want to look at possible moderating variables, or to pick up Patty's term yesterday, differential susceptibility. And I would like to say a little bit about individual differences and about situational characteristics, including characteristics of the game, and then focus on the second question a bit more about promising interventions. So what's the evidence on individual differences in the extent to which players are affected by violent video games? And I think it's important to mention that we're not talking here about differences in the level of violent video game exposure or aggression, but we're talking about differences in the strength of the association between the two. And there are some obvious candidates to look at, and to kind of answer the question, I've looked at some recent meta-analysis, most importantly the one by Krahe, Anderson, 2010. So an obvious candidate is gender. Are male and female players affected differently? And at least in the 2010 meta-analysis, there is no evidence of a gender effect as a moderator. Similarly, there is not much evidence of age effects in these meta-analyses, only on few of the considered measures. And importantly, there is also not much evidence of a moderating effect of culture, comparing data from Asia with data from the United States, but also collaborative research that we have done comparing evidence from the United States and several European countries. Another candidate might be ethnic background. There seems to be very little there. We've done a study in Germany comparing Turkish youth with German youth. And in fact, the Turkish youth have quite a different media diet, not so much in the video game area, but in the television and film area. So we considered differences in the media diet and still couldn't find any differences in the strength of the association between violent media use and aggression. There is the issue of trait aggression. Are people who are habitually more likely to show an aggressive behavior more affected by media violence? Again, there is some indication that this might play a role, but the evidence is not very strong. Looking at game characteristics, there seems to be... Yeah? All right. Wait a minute. Okay. No, we want to go back a little bit. Sorry. There was seems to be an increasing interest in looking at differences to do with the playing itself. For example, the degree of realism. And there's some indication that the effects are stronger the more realistic the violence that is performed in the virtual reality. That the effects are stronger the more players identify with a character and the more immersed they are in the game. And I also identified a number of studies looking particularly at the avatar. And I want to mention one study by a German colleague of mine, Peter Fischer, who manipulated whether players were able to personalize their game character, making it similar to themselves, as opposed to using a standard avatar, and he found that the effects were actually stronger with the personalized avatars. And research by Rowell, Huesmann and colleagues has shown that avatar race and gender also affect the strength of the association between violent video game and aggression, in the sense that players playing a game with a black avatar showed more aggression than those playing with a white avatar, and players playing a male avatar were also more aggressive than players playing a white avatar. So there is some evidence, that's my message, that these characteristics of the game itself may be relevant in moderating the strength of the effects, but the evidence, I would say, is not dramatically strong, and it doesn't suggest that there are certain conditions, like the control conditions here, that do not show any effects at all. Moving on to my second question, what are promising interventions for reducing the effect of violent video games. And I want to take a very quick look at the question of what is a good intervention? How do we recognize a good intervention when we see one? I would say a good intervention is one that's tailored to the target group. That may sound obvious to you, but it's not always reflected in reality. So we may need different interventions for younger children compared to adolescents, for certain groups with problematic video game use. And in order to tailor interventions to the target group, we need a good understanding of the underlying processes that cause the effects. We need interventions that are evidence-based, that are systematically evaluated, and we need to be clear about the outcomes that the interventions are intended to produce. And I've listed here a few relevant outcomes, a few outcomes that have been addressed in past research, primarily a decreased dosage of media violence, improved self-regulation, better understanding of the effects. But in the final instance, I think what we want to see is whether the interventions are successful in reducing aggressive behavior and possibly increasing or buffering the negative effect on pro-social behavior. Here's some examples of existing interventions, all of which target elementary school children. And even though there is an overall shortage of intervention studies, the ones that we do have almost exclusively target younger children, elementary school children. And you can see here, without me going into detail, that they have had some success in decreasing media exposure, but not necessarily decreasing aggression, or I'd rather say the evidence is mixed in terms of the ability of these interventions in reducing aggression. I want to show you in my final minutes an example of an intervention that we developed in Germany that targets specifically adolescents, and it was not specifically designed to address violent video game play, but screen violence use more generally. We built this intervention into a 4-wave longitudinal study, the design of which you can see at the bottom. And because we ran this study in schools, and because we ran it in Berlin, where we have very large schools, we were able to select within each school and year cohort one class for our intervention and compare it to a matched control from the same school and the same year cohort for our control group. And we had 683 students starting in grade 7, and were able to study them again at 4 follow-up points after the intervention. I'd like to mention briefly that although my focus today is on the intervention side, it's also a design that we can use, I think, to test causal hypotheses about media violence effects in combination with a longitudinal perspective. Because effectively what we're doing here is we are experimentally decreasing the extent of violent media use, and if we can show that this decreases aggression, then I think this can also help to make the point of a causal relationship between the two. Just very briefly, 2 final slides about the effects. This is the effect on media violence use measured at the follow-up 7 months after the intervention. We found no effect in our control group, but a significant effect in the intervention group. Now, this can be due to social desirability, but I can say that we have the sustained effect up until our 4th data wave, 30 months after this 5-week intervention. In terms of aggressive behavior, which we measured through self-reports and teacher reports, we found at the immediate follow-up 7 months later, no effect amongst the participants low on initial aggression, but we did find a lower level of aggression in our intervention group amongst those who had high levels of aggression to begin with. And I can say that in the longer term, we found an effect even among the low aggressive group at our 3rd and 4th data wave, in the sense that this group then developed a greater normative acceptance of aggression compared to the people who were in our control group. So I think I'll leave it at that and happy to answer questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
we need to go back to yours.
Yeah. Okay, now we're going to turn to, for a final question, to a slightly different question, which is more of a legal question about the Supreme Court decision striking down a California law. Amusingly enough, this is known as Schwarzenegger versus Electronic Game Association, but Schwarzenegger was on the side of the law because he was the governor when it started. Anyway, to talk about that, we're going to have Angela Campbell from Georgetown University Law School. Angela?
No, I'm not scientist, I'm a lawyer, and the only time I research, just one correction, when the case was called Schwarzenegger versus Entertainment Marketing Association in the Ninth Circuit, the Court of Appeals in California, when it went up to the Supreme Court, Jerry Brown had become governor, so it's actually called Brown versus Entertainment Marketing Association. First, I want to give you just a brief background. This was not the first case involving a law trying to restrict minors' access to violent video games. The first case came in the year, or the first law that was passed was by Indianapolis in the year 2000, and it was immediately challenged by the video game industry in court and was ultimately found to be unconstitutional. And then we saw this pattern repeated 8 times over in different states and localities. They would try different kinds of laws, and there was more research, of course, as time went on. But in every single case, the video game industry won, and these laws were they didn't even go into effect. And 2 of the cases, or I guess actually 4 of the cases, had gone up to the appeals court level, and so there were 2. I think it was the 7th Circuit and the 8th Circuit had decisions on this. So then when it went up, the California case goes up to the 9th Circuit, and it also holds the law unconstitutional. So this is, in that case, it's highly unusual that the Supreme Court would even hear the case. The state of California asked the court to hear it because they had lost, and it was really quite surprising that, at least to most legal watchers, that the court took it, because if they think they got the right result, then there was no reason to take the case. And there was the usual reason they take cases is there's a conflict, or conflicting decisions among the lower courts, and there was no conflict here. So it suggested that maybe some number of justices were actually interested in perhaps reversing the Ninth Circuit. But nonetheless, the majority agreed with the Ninth Circuit that it was unconstitutional, and the opinion for the majority is written by Justice Scalia, and what's interesting about this is he's one of the more conservative members of the court, but he is joined by 3 of the most liberal members of the court, Ruth Ginsburg, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan, and then Justice Kennedy is kind of the swing vote on the court. So it's a very unusual, this kind of combination of justices joining the same opinion is unusual. Then we had a concurring opinion, which means that they agreed with the outcome, but they didn't agree with the reasoning of the majority. And that was 2 conservative justices. It was written by Justice Alito and joined by the Chief Justice Roberts. And their concern was that they thought the majority was too quick to dismiss the possibility that playing video games and that could be different than other experiences, and that could really have a bad effect on minors. Then you had 2 different dissents. Again, one conservative judge, Justice Thomas, and he thinks that, basically, his argument has to do with the intentions of the founders. And then a more liberal justice, Justice Breyer, and he says, look, this is just a modest restriction. all it does is really prevent a minor from buying a gruesomely violent video game that the industry itself has rated as inappropriate for minors. So what's the big deal? Now, so let me go back. So we have the reason I want to. So the literature. There's a lot of articles written about this case in the past 4 years, and a lot of them are sort of focusing on the question: did the justices not understand social science, and is that the problem? They really just don't understand scientific research, or is the problem that the research was really not very good? And I'm not going to take a position on that because I am not qualified to take a position on that. But I actually want to say that I think that there are other equally, if not more important things going on in that case. And the primary one was the way the issues were framed and argued by the lawyers. And I don't think the state of California did a very good job in the way they presented the case. I don't know how much time I have to go into detail, but to understand this, courts have three different tests they could apply when they're reviewing a state statute. The easiest test to meet is called rational basis, and this is not a test that is usually applied for regulation of speech. It'd be more like for economic regulation. And the state of California was trying to argue that that was the right test here because of a 1968 case called Ginsburg versus New York, which upheld a statute that prohibited the sale of girly magazines to minors. And their theory was, if that's harmful to minors and can be prohibited, certainly these excessively violent games are harmful and they could be prohibited under the same theory. But the problem was that the court had actually rejected a very similar argument just the year before, and they said, we're only going to apply this test where it's sex, first of all, and where there's been a tradition of understanding that it wasn't appropriate for minors. And so, basically, they said, we're not going to apply this test, and then California didn't really have a fallback argument. So by losing the standard of review, they lost the case. The next level test is called intermediate scrutiny. I think that's what should have applied here. It has to do with regulations that are addressing conduct, in this case sales, but that have an incidental effect on speech. And then the third possibility is what the majority did is strict scrutiny, which is a very, very hard test to meet. You say they have to show an actual compelling problem and that would be solved by your regulation, and it's just the only way, the least restrictive way in terms of speech to address that problem. And so Justice Scalia writes that they can't meet that test because they haven't shown that there's an actual problem, that the studies purport to show a connection, but studies rejected by every court to consider them, and with good reason. They do not prove that violent video games cause minors to act aggressively. And then he also found that there was no problem. Parents didn't have any need the state stepping in for them because they had the ratings. But even if even if there was a compelling governmental interest here, this law doesn't really address it because it's both under-inclusive and it's over-inclusive. Now, so I want to suggest that mostly the lawyers, the way this was framed was a legal issue. California tried to fit its case within this exception where they're trying to show that there's a state interest, a longstanding interest in regulating violence. So they're like citing these statutes from Illinois from 1889. And this really backfired because the video game industry, their brief opens with this sentence: the California statute of bar is the latest in a long history of overreactions to new expressive media. Now, the industry was represented by a man named Paul Smith, who is a well-known, very well-regarded Supreme Court advocate. And what's happened in recent years is Supreme Court practice has become very specialized, and there's very few people in the country that have an opportunity to do these arguments. California, on the other hand, was represented by someone who had never been before the Supreme Court before. And so I think that that was one of and the industry, of course, can afford to pay for the very best counsel, and that's what they did. And Paul had also been the counsel for them in many of the earlier challenges. So he knew these arguments backwards and forwards. He knew the court. He knew what would appeal to which judges, and he had all of these advantages over California. The other thing I think that was a factor in the outcome is the judge's own experience with video games, and which was basically nothing. But I think that allowed Justice Scalia to really buy the arguments the industry is making that, look, this is no different than the Odyssey or the Grimm's fairy tales. Violence is a part of life, and so on and so forth. Now, 2 of the justices actually played some video games, a game that was at issue in the case. And this is in a wonderful interview with Justice Kagan at Harvard Law School fairly recently, where she describes the scene where she and the law clerk has set up the game in the chambers of Justice Breyer. And so they're playing this game, and she's saying, and we're killing right and left, and she's having a great time. But Justice Breyer just thought it was totally repulsive and disgusting and just, And so I think, so she says, I think that's maybe why we came out on different sides of the case. But also, I think the 2 concurring justices, they're the ones that have children of video game playing age, either at the time, like in 2005 when the law was passed, or 2010 when it was argued. So I think they were much more concerned about this. And Justice Alito actually went out and did his own research about virtual reality, for example, and some of the really immersive effects of video games that we should expect in the future. And that's why he didn't want to close the door to regulating them. And then Justice Breyer, he actually purported to apply strict scrutiny, but as I said, he didn't think there was really much of a speech interest here, and so he wanted to defer. He says, look, he also did all this research. Said, I don't know what to make sense of this scientific literature. I'm going to defer to the public health associations and to the state of California, and so if they think there's a problem, then I think it's fine. So I think I'm probably out of time. Okay, so I'll be happy to take any questions.